This is the Pub Test. And welcome to this week's edition of the Pub Test. It's really great to be here today. My name is Neil Farrow and I'm here with my co-host Erin Watson, and our Pub Test topics of the day this week are what's happening in Victoria in relation to the bushfires and now the floods and sort of the politics of all of that. We're then kicking across to the national stage where Parliament is back and sitting this week. So Monday and Tuesday this week, Parliament is sitting to discuss both the hate laws and the gun laws. And this was a recall of Parliament by the Prime Minister in the result and the tragedy of the Bondi massacre. So touching on the gun laws and the hate law reforms. And then finally, we're going to the international topic of the week, which is what is happening here in Iran. A very interesting part of the world. It's really great to be here again today for this week's podcast. Erin, what's been happening in your world?
Well, I'm actually on the podcast today from the north part of New South Wales, like northern New South Wales. And I've got to say, I feel like I'm kind of between the middle of cyclones and bushfires and floods. And there's like this little part of Australia where everything's going okay at the moment. So it's actually really delightful up here right now.
That's excellent. Well, down in Victoria, we've had heaters and coolers, air conditioning, flooding and fires. And as some of you know, I live out in regional Victoria in the Macedon Ranges, and Erin's originally from country and regional Western Australia. But for our first topic of the pub test this week, we're going to dive into what is happening with Victorian politics. Now, Victorian Premier Jacinta Allan has just announced a formal review into the Victorian bushfire disaster. And there's been a number of critiques from all sides in relation to, has enough been done? Are the fire tankers too old? Is Victoria up for it? And in the midst of all of this, all the fires across the state, we've actually had some flooding down in Wye River on the Great Ocean Road as well. So, Erin, what's your take on Victorian fire and flooding politics this week?
It is all happening. I mean, you can see I've got a TV going behind me, but, 1 minute it's bushfires, the next minute it's floods. It really is crazy, down there, particularly like it's a holiday season. Everyone's down, whether they're on the coast or, whether they're inland, whatever it is, school holidays are still happening. So it's kind of, it's very sad actually to see what is happening. And, I really feel for all of those people. But what it has led way for is for a very interesting week of politics as well. And there's a whole bunch of different things going on that we could be talking about. What could be the glory stories for the Victorian government, like, the road infrastructure and railways, that all seems to be a bit of a disaster. But at the same time, what's really taking front page is obviously the response to these crises. So both the bushfires and now these floods. But perhaps we're going to hone in a little bit more on the response to the bushfires in particular, because we can start to really see that playing out now. And I do have to say, actually, when I was flying up here to New South Wales, or you fly up to the Gold Coast and then come down here, I did see the South Australian firefighters in the airport lounge. So big shout out to them. I kind of wanted to go up to them and say, oh my gosh, you guys are so amazing, but it just felt a little bit quaint, so I didn't. And but I'm saying it here today instead. So the politics of this, I mean, I perhaps didn't even realise how bad some of the gear was that these firefighters are supposed to be using, to fight these fires. So some of these trucks are 30 years old, some without air conditioning. I mean, that is just absolutely crazy. The UFU boss, Peter Marshall, who is an interesting character, he came out and said that 50 fire trucks had failed, which is an enormous failure. And so obviously how the government then responds to this situation is really going to shake the politics of the week. And I think that obviously Jacinta Allan did not respond fast enough. Jess Wilson, the opposition leader, she came forward and was showing quite a great deal of leadership. She was able to sort of fill that vacuum. And now the response there was a petition this week that was seeking an inquiry into the bushfires and what had actually happened. The Premier has now had to formally announce that inquiry as well. So there's been a lot of pressure on the Premier. I think the response has been very good on Jess Wilson's side. It's quite interesting. Some of my favourite footage of her this week was when she turned up and met up with some of the firefighters and took them a few cases of Great Northern mid-strength beers and a few cases of water, and I thought that was great politics and optics.
It's an interesting one. So obviously in Australia, and I live out in regional Victoria, so I live in the Macedon Ranges. So the Friday a couple of weeks ago was definitely not a great day for me. We had our fire grab bags prepared, as you do living in regional Australia. You're sort of your passports and documents and a few clothes and some stuff for the dogs in case anything comes by. And the fires did get quite close to where we were in the Macedon Ranges this time. So obviously Harcourt was burnt. I think it was over 80 dwellings in Harcourt were
Right.
impacted. And critically across that space, there was a number of sort of quite historical things that were destroyed around Australia's wine and cidery history and things like that as
Mm.
well. And a girlfriend of mine lives out in Yea, which is sort of to the northwest of Melbourne, and everything on her property was burnt except her main house. So again, it's another bushfire season hitting Australia relatively early, unfortunately, in the season, and was a little bit rough for regional Victoria. It's
I
interesting.
want to jump in on you there, Neil, because you live in regional Victoria. How do you assess the Premier's response? Because there has been a report sitting on her desk for months now, I think, that had never been released. And she has come out and said that, one, there'll be this review, and two, some additional funding. It's around $80 million for the CFA. What is your assessment of the political performance this week as someone who's sitting out there really at the coalface of these fires?
Look, I think there's a lot of challenges this government will face in Victoria. And obviously, my politics is clear and have ran for Labor historically. But, Labor has been in government for a long time in Victoria. And so challenges like this sort of compound as people are sort of going, well, this and this and this. I think regional Victoria's had a number of challenges that the government or the opposition actually will need to get ahead of over the coming couple of weeks. Now, as I said, I live in the Macedon Ranges. I often catch the train into the city. More often than not, my train is cancelled or delayed or postponed. And my partner who travels in and out as well, it's kind of been turning into sort of 2 or 3 hour train trips on what should be a 1 hour journey. And so people remember that, and then they're like, okay, there's a few kind of potholes in the road, and what's the complications there? And then obviously the fire stuff has been sort of the ongoing challenge on top of that as well. Now, obviously the CFA and obviously the Metro Fire Brigade do an tremendously amazing job across Victoria, but the challenges are the infrastructure. To protect a property in a regional area, you typically need 2 fire trucks and probably dozer lines to protect a property. Do we have that quantum of trucks? Are they sufficient? Where are they being spread? But there's really other compounding changes from the fire perspective as well. Our seasons are getting longer. We can no longer rely upon the US sending firefighting equipment here. It's damning across all politics in Australia that in all of Australia we only have one permanent firefighting aircraft that's actually owned by the New South Wales Rural Firefighting Service. And there's been federal discussions for years over, do we develop our own fleet? How do we manage this across different states and territories? And while it's really great seeing South Australia or New South Wales share their resources, I think a really nationalised model needs to start to look at how we respond to bushfires and natural disasters. In my lifetime, I've been through the Canberra bushfire. My sister went through the Cobargo bushfire, where, of course, that was the one where Scott Morrison wouldn't hold a hose. We've now been through the Victorian bushfires, and I think, there's definitely not a moment like the Scott Morrison forced handshake for Jacinta Allen, but it does highlight some of the challenges of being in government for quite a while in Victoria.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what
Far too
can
long.
be changed.
And I think, firefighting as an industry, though, let's touch on that for a little bit, because I think this is going to be quite interesting going into the future as well. And how are you going to attract young people to work in the CFA, because the conditions are appalling. And if you've ever been in a fire before, which I actually have in a training environment. So when you do offshore sailing and work in the offshore industry, you do this little thing called an STCW 95. And as part of that offshore safety certification, you have to do firefighting. And I did it out in New Zealand in 2011. And we basically had to go up 3 or 4 levels of shipping containers that were on fire, holding the hose, holding the branch, and going through and basically putting out these fires and ensuring that everybody got out safely. Because one of the most dangerous things in the world, obviously, is a fire on a vessel. And it was I remember coming out of that just sort of really shaken by the experience. And I couldn't imagine what that must be like to actually be in the middle of the ocean, let alone, in the middle of the country in Australia fighting a fire. So when you put together the lack of funding, because the opposition were very smart this week in calling out the relative decline in funding for the CFA. In fact, it's not relative decline, it is actual decline. Funding fell from around 350 million to around 339 million, right? So not an insignificant decrease. You've got further projected drops in funding over coming years as well. And so like, how are you going to attract young, I'm going to say mostly guys. I'm sure I saw some female firefighters in the airport lounge yesterday. But how are you going to attract people to this job, which we're going to need increasingly in Australia as the climate does change? And what are we going to do in that sense? So perhaps from a skills perspective and a workforce perspective, your idea of a more national style response could be a way to go.
It's interesting as well. So the CFA in Victoria, very similar to the New South Wales Rural Fire Service and sort of the rural fire services in other states and territories, is largely a volunteer force. So what they do is they have sort of their core operating staff that are paid and are headquarters, as does New South Wales Rural Fire Service and the rural fire services of a number of other states and territories. But they're largely supplemented by a completely volunteer force. So the town I live in Kyneton, has a totally volunteer fire brigade, effectively. So,
Do
that
you
fire
volunteer?
brigade. I don't volunteer, unfortunately. I did do some volunteer work historically with the New South Wales Rural Fire Service a number of years ago, but not with the CFA in Victoria. Apparently, there's a waiting list for volunteers for the
Wow.
CFA.
Yeah.
But they're genuinely really committed individuals,
Yeah.
and I think the volunteer model has worked. But as climate change continues to impact, is it going to remain any longer? And I think it raises the broader issue around this as well. How do you reconcile on the Liberal side of politics that, there's still this weird aversion to actually climate change happening? Now, we've seen in Victoria, we had fires one day and then floods the next. Surely that's a symptom of sort of climate change and potentially climate change denial from the Conservative side of
I don't think
politics.
that's a very mainstream view in the opposition in Victoria or federally at the moment. I mean, there are obviously people who come out and say these things, but I don't think it's a very mainstream view. And I think that most people understand that it's about how we manage this energy transition, and we do that in a way where we have reliable energy sources while at the same time leveraging our incredible endowments that we have in this country. I think we get some of when most sunniest place on earth or something like that. Like, the opportunities are enormous, and I think that it's more in the approach than the fundamental science of it. And as you say, you can sort of see it all around us now.
Let's contrast that as well. So I know there's been some critique around the Premier, obviously, in Victoria. To his credit, the Prime Minister was very quickly down in the bushfires in Victoria. There was a very quick announcement of a Commonwealth State Disaster Recovery funding arrangement. We have had very quick movements from our Prime Minister in relation to the tragedy and obviously the loss of life and buildings, of which I think it's now over 800 structures have been lost in Victoria and fires still burning. And, isn't it interesting, though, to contrast, while it might have been a bit slow from a state government perspective, the Prime Minister was here very, very quickly. And you look historically, there's been, leaders have won or lost effectively because of their response to things like bushfires and natural disasters in Australia. And I think Albo was on the ground, I think on Sunday, which was, so 2 days while bushfires were still happening in Victoria, he was on the ground announcing some of that disaster relief arrangement. So less
And it
than
goes
48
to
hours
show how
afterwards.
poorly the Victorian government has performed here, because that's the thing. Like, you have to be able to show up and you have to be able to answer questions. And everybody saw that footage the other day of the Premier walking out of that meeting looking like she was she was ignoring questions from people who are in these communities. And I think that you have to be it's really tough. It's a tough job, but get out there and stand up and answer questions and say, actually, maybe we have mismanaged this. Like, for example, you probably would have seen this conversation, or at least heard about it, was the length of grass
On the Hume Highway.
on the Hume Highway, the technicalities around this, and the fact that that's been really, really poorly managed. So you've got to come out and go, you know what, actually, we have failed here, and we need to look at new solutions. I think we might have said this in our previous podcasts. So you've just got to show up. You've got to show up, or else someone else fills the vacuum. And I think that's what Jess Wilson has done very well this week.
And I think the interesting side of this is, and look, we're unashamedly quite a centrist podcast here, sort of looking at things without sort of the yelling and screaming. But, I think reasonable Australians from both sides of politics are really after that sort of presence. And I will give the Premier credit. She did cancel her leave and started her, the engagements around the bushfire. The Prime Minister has come on board. But that then potentially sort of, not the excuses I'd say, but some of the discussion subsequent to overfunding, I thought it was a little bit disappointing to say, year on year, the funding has increased to the CFA, because it's like, well, actually the annual report shows something different. So just give the public the honesty over, fire funding does fluctuate for a whole heap of reasons. And as long as, there's a commitment to focus on it and make improvements, I think that's pretty critical. And you're right, the opposition in Victoria has dived in onto the lack of the annual report being released for the Country Fire Authority in Victoria. Victoria, and that's definitely been one of their key points.
I think this has been really interesting to watch, because even like how you say, oh, we're unashamedly centrist, and we're, that's which is why we agree so much with each other rather than arguing with each other, which I think the punters will like. But anyway, this week is really, Jess is actually, she's had facts and figures to fight with. And that's the situation we're in Victoria, where if you look at facts objectively, things are going backwards and they're not looking great. Whereas I think in the past, there hasn't been the same ammunition to throw. So then it just becomes really shouty politics. Oh, you're this, you're that. You're not actually going, well, actually, your funding has declined. By the way, the Auditor General has come out and said the report's sitting there. And then Jess can come out and say, well, why isn't the report released? I mean, what are you hiding? So that's where we are at in Victoria. And I think that most people I speak to, except for my people that I know who actually work in the Labor government, particularly political officers, most people understand the government's not performing very well. And they've probably been there for a little bit too long. And there are some trends we're really seeing, like a lack of transparency around reports being released for inquiries and so on and so forth. So, I think I think the majority of Victorians are on a unity ticket here.
Well, at least there's a unity ticket, I'd say, and this is our spark of controversy today. At least there is a unity ticket within the Labor Party. It looks as if the Liberal Party in Victoria has lost another deputy leader, and there's big pre-selection battles ahead. So I suppose it's up to the people of Victoria. Will a government who is doing their best in the circumstances of being in government quite a long time be able to hold, or would we prefer a government that kind of can't even agree with each other, as seems to be happening in the Liberal Party in Victoria?
Oh, come on. A pre-selection in the news is normal stuff. That's, it's like that. I don't think that that's unusual, and you'll see some of the same things happen if you've got rotation out of your seats as well. I think it's interesting with the deputy leader, with Sam Groth stepping back, and he doesn't come from a political world. And so I actually kind of empathise with his views on, not wanting to deal with this anymore, because actually it is, if you're not a political animal, I think politics can be really, it's a lot for you and your family. And he had those awful stories about, him and his wife last year, and that's not for public consumption. What I don't even want to talk about it here. Like that's none of our business. And this is where those things get really, really messy, and where normal people, let's say, walk away from politics, because it's like, it's a really brutal sport. So look, I think that, David Southwick, he's experienced, he's been around a long time, is quite sensible. I think he'll probably be a good steady set of hands for Jess, in a way that Sam was quite new as well. So it was like, a very new team, whereas you've got someone who's been around long enough, who really knows the ropes, plus Jess, who's got, great credentials herself. But I think that's what she's kind of very good at, is going, maybe I need this bit of support and I need that bit of support, and she's hired accordingly or appointed accordingly. And I kind of admire that in someone, because it is humble.
Victorian politics, I would definitely say, compared to some of our former prime ministers, Albo has definitely passed the pub test, specifically for the bushfires in Victoria. Very quickly on the ground, very quickly announcing disaster relief, being present, not making some forced handshakes or telling people he doesn't hold a hose. Your reflection is perhaps less so at the Victorian level in relation to the pub test of the Victorian fires this week. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Jess absolutely passed the pub test. She passed the Great Northern Mid-Strength pub test. I thought that was really fantastic. And obviously the Premier has not passed the pub test, and has time to rectify
but Albo,
it.
I'll pin you there on Albo. Has Albo passed the pub test just in relation to the bushfire handling in Victoria? He was there within 48 hours.
Yeah, I mean, Susan Lee did the same, right? She was out visiting the control centre, and she was doing all the same things as well. And I think that when it comes to the pub test here, like, are they even the right people to be questioning about the pub test? I think we need to be looking very, very hard at our state government, who had the majority of the responsibility here to not get here in the first place, but then also in the response. Maybe Susan and Albo can have a beer together this time. That's not going to work.
The one reflection that we've both had, though, is we do need to look more nationally around how we're dealing with fires and emergency management across Australia. And I think, we've got disagreement or agreement around who has or who hasn't at a personality level. But I think the really important side of this is it is starting to show now across Australia, whether it's the cyclones in Queensland or the fires in Victoria, and then the floods that hit sort of the Great Ocean Road soon after, that we do need to be more prepared from an emergency management perspective. I really don't think it's good enough for Australia. And this is both sides of government, internationally, the fact that we really only have one permanent firefighting aircraft in Australia and the rest are borrowed, loaned or hired from Europe and the US. And that might be fine while ever they had short fire seasons, but as their fire seasons are getting longer,
Yeah, totally.
it's
Yeah.
going to give us less and less access to equipment. And so I think there is a really big call on both sides of politics federally to, get a national fleet of firefighting equipment together and really leverage some of that as well at a national level. So next on the pub test, we stay nationally now and we're focusing on the fact that Parliament has been recalled to Canberra on Monday and Tuesday this week. Now, it's very unusual for Parliament to be recalled, let alone on the summer holidays where most politicians are off enjoying a break, and most Australians generally don't want to talk politics between Christmas and Australia Day. Yet Parliament is back and sitting and they're discussing two reforms combined into one this week around the act called the Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism Bill 2026. Erin, what's your thoughts over what is happening in Canberra?
Well, I think we have so much to talk about. We can fill up the rest of this podcast with this. But, I think that one of the interesting dynamics here, which say Bridget McKenzie from the Nationals in Victoria has been quite vocal about, is that gun laws and hate speech are being treated in the same legislation. So that's quite an interesting dynamic. And I can actually kind of understand that perspective, because you're sort of conflating, like that's the only reason you would have the gun laws, or the gun laws are only because of the hate speech, where I kind of understand that you might make those quite two distinct pieces of legislation. What do you think?
So let's dive into the detail as to what is actually proposed in this bill, just to give everyone online a little bit more information. So the bill Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism Bill does have two main components. So the first part of the bill is a whole heap of national gun law reforms. So included in those gun law reforms are things like a national gun buyback co-funded by the states on a 50-50 funding basis. This will be the largest gun buyback since 1996 and obviously Port Arthur. The second element of the bill will be stricter import control, so restricting the importation of a whole heap of different weapons, including assisted repeating and straight pull firearms, reducing magazine capacity and rounds, firearm suppressors and speed loaders. So they'll be banned from importing.
Right.
So that's obviously within the Commonwealth's powers around export. The next thing is expanded background checking, so improving some of the background checking and the coordination between the states and territories. Citizenship requirements on all guns, so you won't be able to hold a gun license unless you're a citizen. Some limits on the number of guns you can own. If I remember off the top of my head, I think it is 4 for most people and 10 in regional and rural areas. And the acceleration of a national firearms register. So the first part of the reforms are all about gun laws. The second part of the reforms, though, and they're together in one bill, is in relation to hate speech reforms, which includes proposed reforms aimed at strengthening laws against promoting hatred. So this is looking at things like creating a new federal offence for publicly promoting or inciting hatred based on race, colour, or national or ethnic origin. So it's tightening up our hate law reforms, including looking at things like designating prohibited hate groups, increasing some of the penalties in that space, and creating a new offence or an aggregated offence for religious officials advocating violence. It also bans a number of symbols, including a number of symbols that are often used by the far left and the far right, and creates a new ground to cancel visas for individuals spreading hatred or extremism. So it's a comprehensive legislative agenda that aims to target a lot of the things that have been in the media since the Bondi massacre in December.
There's a lot going on, right? And so I can kind of, as you're talking through it, I sort of go, okay, the gun laws thing, I can see how there is largely people are supportive of these gun reforms, right? So that's probably a good thing. But then you've got this huge agenda with the hate speech laws. And I think that's the one that's become more controversial, and that's the piece that's more difficult for the Prime Minister to get through, because at the moment that's probably not going to happen. Why don't we take a step back and have a look at the lead up to getting into Canberra this week as well? I think that there was a lot of people who were really unhappy about Parliament being recalled, even though that original call came from the Liberal National Coalition. I heard that in Labor there were a lot of people who were really unhappy about it for a few different reasons. One, now this is a little gossip that I'm sharing, so I'm speculating here, but one, people weren't happy that you're going to have this huge piece of legislation that needs to be passed within 2 days, and you're not giving any time to the condolences and giving people that space to reflect on what has happened as a country in Parliament. So if you think about a 2-day sitting week, you're going to have the Prime Minister speak, the opposition leader speak, and give their condolences, and then nobody else. And then you want to rush through this legislation, which is actually super, super complex. So I heard people are not very happy, and particularly in Labor are not very happy. And a lot of this has been kept very, very tightly. So have you heard anything kind of similar with what's been going on in the lead up to this, and to why there might be such a backlash against the bill?
The messages that I'm hearing around the ground is, there's a lot of complexity in this space, but that Labor would very much like to ensure that these reforms are through before the year begins effectively. So, it gives Labor an opportunity to start afresh once these reforms are going through.
They want a quick win for the year.
Not necessarily a quick win, but, it's very complex legislation. And the other side of it is we are juggling everything from sort of immigration and visa reforms to gun buybacks. But it is a fairly comprehensive response to what happened in Sydney, and, a response that subsequent to the Jewish community has come out in support of. LGBTI groups have said, as long as we're protected by this as well, in support of as well. And interestingly enough, consistently in Australia, over something like 80 or 90% of Australians support consistently tighter gun reforms in Australia.
Yeah.
So, while there's concerns over elements of the bills, and I can appreciate sort of the concern of bundling it together, it's actually government bundles of both political colours, bundles legislative reforms together in a number of occasions to make sure that they're comprehensively dealing with a specific issue. And in relation to this, there's concerns from the far left over, the right to protest and the freedom of speech, and the far right has come out and saying, well, I want to be able to verbalise my bigotry effectively.
Yeah, I remember
and
that one.
vice versa.
But it's not actually just the far right who are coming out and saying this. There was a letter written today by an interfaith group. You had leaders from the Buddhist community, the Sikh community, the Christian community, Scientologists were there, the Sikhs were there, and they basically said religious freedom includes the right of individuals and communities to teach, preach, and express their beliefs openly and publicly, including through sermons, religious education, pastoral guidance, and so on and so forth, right? And then they said, provided such expression does not incite physical harm or violence, it must be protected as a legitimate exercise of religious practice. So it's not some radical far right group that are saying, oh, we need to protect, free speech. Let's just call it that. It's actually, these are religious groups. A lot of Australians would identify with one of these religious groups. So it's not some radical right-wing idea, the idea to protect free speech. I actually think it's far more mainstream than that. And when, I can imagine what certain analysts will be saying about this as well, which is who gets to decide? Who gets to decide what is okay and what is not okay? And that's part of the problem and why this becomes very political.
So I think there's some interesting points there. There's a clear carve-out in these laws for what's called religious reflection effectively. So there's a principles-based test that says, if you are repeating what is in your religious text, whatever that may be, that's exempt from these laws and these reforms. But you've also got to be really cautious about religion's creep into government and, disclosure of my concerns over here, because those same groups that are complaining over these laws were the ones who were very vocal in relation to things like a position against marriage equality and about giving LGBTI groups the right to, be equal in society, something I'm obviously personally very passionate about as well. And so the other side of it is Australia doesn't have a freedom of religion. In fact, we had a referendum in the late 1980s that very much rejected the concept that we have a freedom of religion. Now, that's not necessarily saying it's government's role to dictate our religion, but that was put to the Australian people and it failed when we wanted to enshrine the freedom of religion. And I think Australians most moderate Australians kind of understand that, yes, we've got free speech, but there are limits. And yes, we've got freedom to practice religion, but there are limits there as well. And, putting it bluntly, whatever your religious background is, if you are calling for violence against others, I genuinely don't think it has any place in Australia. And, Malinakis, the Premier of South Australia, came out with a beautiful statement in relation to this, more specifically for the Adelaide Festival, but reflecting upon his views. And he got very tearful over the fact that, you've got to ask why these people are making these comments. So Malinakis in South Australia has come out and said, what are people saying? I think Chris Minns did a beautiful comment. It was effectively saying, if you're making these comments, you've got to ask the question, why? The other side of it that I find really interesting in this space is we've spent over the past 3 or 4 years, probably longer, literally having the discussion that if you give men, particularly sort of under this toxic masculinity banner, if men are exposed to words and expressions that are degrading towards women, then that leads to real outcomes and real consequences. And the argument is that should be the same when it comes to religious text or religious hatred or religious commentary. You can't on one side say, well, hang on, we're going to radicalize a teenage male if he sees or hears something, but then on the same side say, well, no, religious preachers can say whatever they want and that won't have a radicalization effect. Like you can't have your cake and eat it too in those sorts of circumstances, particularly given the history of, everyone in Australia knows that if you expose men to, certain podcasts and, what are the consequences there? We've heard that. So why is it that words cause actions in some spaces, but words don't cause actions in other? And I think that's what Middle Australians will be asking when this bill's debated.
Yeah, and you sort of go to some really good points there about what is actually the underlying problem here. Because if you're able to address the underlying problem, you don't need the laws either. If you're saying that it's Islamic extremism that's going to lead to gun violence and people dying, as, we saw in Bondi, the gun laws aren't necessarily going to fix anything if the underlying ideology is still there. And if you could address the ideology, you wouldn't actually then need to tighten those gun laws. So, that when you're dealing the symptom, not the problem. And that's partly what's happening here, I think. Now, just to disclose, I'm fully supportive of tightening gun laws in Australia.
Staying there on gun laws just for a moment, like you and I both agree, there's no justification for somebody living in a city to have access to a gun. There's none at all.
No,
there's just
There's not.
There's no reason. And I say that, and both Erin and I on this gun laws point, both, my family's in citrus and grapes and my sister's on cattle farms. So, family do have shotguns and operate on farms and in rural and regional Australia. But even then, they don't need 10 or 20 guns. They're quite happy with a couple of shotguns. So I think, the unity ticket here, and this is the Australian consensus over gun laws, is there's really no justification for anyone in the city to have guns in their house.
Maybe we should have called this podcast the Unity Ticket rather than the pub test. That would have been a good title as well. But I don't know that I think that we do have slightly different view. And again, it's about how you approach a problem, not necessarily that we have differences in what the outcome should be. So our unity ticket often is the outcome, but not how we get there and approach the problem. So if we go back to the religion example, which I'm so mindful that these are all such tricky terrain to be talking about on a podcast, but when you talk about the religion example, let's look at the great reporting of Meghna Bali from the ABC this week over in Afghanistan. I don't know if you've seen that, but she had access to a park where it's a men's only park, and she went and met with one of the leaders of the Taliban and really kind of exposes that that very conservative interpretation of Sharia law in Afghanistan and what that now means for women and girls. That is the textbook example of the reason you should have a separation between religion and state. And I think that's kind of, it's not the opposite to what I was talking about before, but at the same time, it's like that is why you should say these things should be separate, because it's a slippery slope.
So do you then, let's jump on that. As a member of the Liberal Party, would you support banning religious symbols in public schools or public libraries or public houses of worship? So, if we're going to separate religion and state, do we take the European model, largely now in France and Denmark and a number of other countries, where they've actually banned all forms of religious symbols in public areas?
Yeah, that is so interesting, because I actually I think it's this not existential question, but certainly like a deep question for Australia to think about. Are we do we still follow a Christian calendar? Are we a Christian country? We kind of are, right? Because we celebrate, our public holidays are around the Christian calendar. They're not around the Buddhist calendar. They're not around the Muslim calendar. They're not around something else. So in a way, and I think that Australians aren't ready for that. I think that Australians largely, regardless of, your religious background, probably think that that's just kind of like a fundamental thing around Australian identity, like the Christmas holidays and then the Easter holidays and, the summer holiday. Like and we're not like the United States where people say, they'll say happy holidays. They don't say, like when I deal with my American clients, they never say, oh, Merry Christmas. They say happy holidays because they've that's like the all-inclusive catch-all term. I think we might have talked about this before. I can't remember, but my favorite is Christmas. Christmas is my favorite, which comes from Seth Cohen in the OC. Do you remember the OC? And he used to,
The
like, because he was
merging
like
of
Jewish
Hanukkah
and
and
Christian, and then
Christmas. Yep.
yes, correct. Christmas, big fan. So, I don't think that we're there as a country. And I think that a lot of people would actually see that as like fundamental to the Australian way of life, whatever that is, because that is an existential question we're always asking. What is it to be Australian? So do you think that people are ready for that here in Australia? I don't think so.
I'm not sure, and I have to disclose, like my mum, she's passed away now, but was of Italian background, and my dad is from New Zealand. So back in the time and the day, that was a controversial marriage because my dad was Anglican and my mum was Catholic,
Same,
and obviously,
Irish
at that
Catholic,
period,
Protestant,
yeah,
right?
you
Very
had the Troubles in
The
Northern
only
Ireland.
reason my family are in Australia on my father's side is because my Irish Catholic great-grandmother and my Protestant great-grandfather could not be together in Belfast.
It's an interesting, and the Belfast story is an interesting one. So both of my grandfathers were involved in World War II on different sides. Obviously, the Italian was on the Axis and the British on the Allies. And so it's just one of those interesting things. And I think this is the key crux of Australia. And this is the question that we actually need to answer is, both my grandparents left their respective countries, so they didn't have to deal with those issues. And I think that's an interesting topic coming up is, my grandfather came out from Italy and, people he previously would have been fighting against in a war, all of a sudden, and they were working together on the railroads in New South Wales. So I think, there's a key part of that Australian identity. And I have to say, I'm not a religious person, so asking me views around religion is definitely not the case. But it's a really big challenge.
Part of the attraction of Australia as a migrant, I think, is that you can come here and practice your religion, regardless of the fact that if we think about the way that our lives are structured around the Christian calendar, my husband and his family are Sinhalese Buddhist and they celebrate Sri Lankan New Year and they have their own celebrations and they can do that while at the same time also having a really nice party at Christmas time. So I think that's actually sort of part of the appeal. The flip side to the European example that you used before about, having religious symbols in public places and so on is a lot of countries around the world celebrate all of the holidays. And it means that they're like the productivity gains of celebrating all of the holidays.
Public holidays a year. I'm up for all those public holidays.
Are you? I don't remember the last time I actually didn't work on a public holiday, but that's small business life, right? And I think that that's something the government doesn't always understand, what it's like for small businesses out there. But anyway, that's another podcast.
So Canberra this week, we have the hate speech laws coming through. We have the gun law reforms coming through. They've both been bundled together. There's controversy on all sides. The Greens aren't happy for one bit of it. The Nationals aren't happy for another bit of it.
Do you think it's going to get through? I don't think they don't have the support. Do they have the numbers? Because remember, everything in politics is numbers.
Everything in politics is numbers. But the other side of it is I'm eternally hopeful. Now, the legislation that's there is not perfect for a whole heap of reasons. It bundles too many issues together. It's not perfect. Does it do this? Does it do that? But my dear hope and aspirations is there enough good in it? And we've really got to get better in Australia in not letting excellent get in the way of good. And we've really got to sort of lean into some of the compromises, even if they're less than perfect.
What do you think that Labor would do a deal on with the Greens or the coalition to get it across the line?
What's my thoughts here? Look, I think, and I've no inside information in relation to this, so this is just sort of navel-gazing activity. I think strengthening some of the changes to some of the other minority groups could potentially get it across the line around the hate speech laws. So you've got a really interesting thing happening with the Greens in Australia around sort of particularly the issue of sort of they've well and truly galvanised around the pro-Palestine issue and sort of the Muslim community or elements of the Muslim community in that regard. So I think, if I think the Greens could be brought on board if some of that was potentially softened and yet it was strengthened around other minority groups. I don't think the Greens have any objections to the gun law reforms. I think so. That's on the Green side. I think on the Liberal side, I think if all of the hate speech laws were kind of parked, the Libs would sign up to the gun reforms, but the Nats wouldn't, in which case that's another passage through Parliament. I don't think One Nation's going to support either. But we do have this weird sort of hypocrisy on both sides of like, I want hate speech laws, but only to the groups that I want hate speech laws for, not to all groups. And so
Yeah.
we've kind of got this thing happening now on both sides of
Yeah.
politics where it's like, the Libs like, I want hate speech laws that benefit the Jewish community, but not the gay community. And then like another group's like, well, I want this community and this community. And it's like, hold on a second, guys. Like, can't we all be getting the benefit of those laws or not? But I think a potential compromise on the Greens will be around the hate speech side. I think the Libs are probably inclined to support some of the hate speech reforms, but the Nats probably not so much the gun reforms. And there is that sort of pivotal question of the test over religious text. So the exemption, as I said earlier, is if you're quoting religious text, that is exempt. Now, that still causes some controversy. You know, I'm a gay guy, so, you know, should I be stoned? That's still inciting violence, but, you know, something, I
Then
think
would be
Leviticus said
protected,
that
right?
as well.
Yeah.
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 And you know, if you have a look at other religious books, both the Quran and the Torah and sort of other bits and pieces, they also have some pretty horrible commentary around sort of different people and othering. So, you know, will it make that much of a difference if you exempt religious texts? That's the question, I guess.
That is the question.
So the bill in Canberra this week, Erin, does it pass the pub test?
I think that it's going to be no surprise to our listeners that it does not pass the pub test. I think that the first part of the legislation or the bill that sort of talks about gun reforms, come on down, come to the pub, come and have a great Northern beer, mid-strength, because guns. And then the second part of the bill obviously probably doesn't pass the pub test. We're not quite there yet. But Neil, you forgot to ask, did the Prime Minister pass the pub test when he recalled Parliament for these 2 days? Just
Well, there we
reflecting back to
go.
some of my little criticisms at the beginning there.
So look, my take on this is I think the bill does pass the pub test. It's not perfect. There's lots of issues. It covers a lot of ground, from visa cancellation to gun laws to hate speech laws. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But, you know, it is a good step forward. I think it's pragmatic. It's responsible. And the other side of it is if everybody is a little bit annoyed, then, you know, it's probably the right bill to pass, to be really forthright. So I actually think the bill does pass the pub test. And what's more in relation to this, and the question of does the Prime Minister pass the pub test, I think it is actually good that he's recalled Parliament for this. You know, the Liberal National Party was calling for it. It's a parliamentary sitting very deliberately focused upon this. After the parliamentary sitting, we obviously have a national day of mourning in relation to what happened in Bondi. So, you know, I actually think this is the Prime Minister getting out in front of the issue, resetting the year with a solid step forward. And as I said, if everyone's equally annoyed about the bill, it's probably a really great bill. And, you know, we've got to have a little bit more willingness to not let perfect get in the way of good. So yeah, on both counts here, both the PM for me and
doesn't
the
it?
bill.
I mean, people are talking, people are debating, people are disagreeing, and that's, you know, politics is, you know, it's the what's the expression? I've
The
forgotten it.
art
Neil,
of the possible. The art of the possible.
No, not the art of the possible. It's the something of ideas. It's the contest
Contest
of
of ideas.
ideas. The contest of ideas. That would have also been a good podcast name. The contest of ideas. And I think that's where Parliament is at its best, when you're looking at a problem from all of these different angles and trying to find some kind of workable solution that also aligns with, you know, our fundamental principles as a country and where we sort of see ourselves going. So I think that is actually a really positive thing. But it sounds like people are a little bit annoyed that they had to cancel their holidays and come back to Parliament. So
Recalling Parliament is a very expensive endeavour as well.
It is very expensive. Hopefully we get some solution.
So, and it was really, really good. On the weekend, I was watching the TV and none other than my amazing co-host, Erin, appeared. Erin, what were you talking about on the weekend?
Yes, we had our first weekend breakfast where I was introduced as Erin, the co-host of the pub test, which was very exciting because I actually wasn't expecting it. But yes, we obviously the big topics of the weekend was Trump announcing these tariffs on Europe until the US buys Greenland, which is just like Such an interesting development and story, and you've really seen Europe dig in their heels about this, as they rightfully should. The other big one was on Iran, of course, with the Supreme Leader, announcing that, obviously there had been deaths, but blaming the US and other international regimes. And then we also had a conversation about surrogacy, which I said to, the team at the ABC, this needs to be a bigger conversation about surrogacy laws in Australia. So this is where people are going offshore and getting caught up in international legal jurisdictions that are preventing them from bringing their children home. So another really big story as well.
And we've got the ABC clip, which we will post online for you guys to have a listen to as well. Have a look and listen to what Erin had to say.
Making headlines today, we are joined now by Foreign Affairs Specialist and co-host of the Pub Test podcast, Erin Watson. Erin, great to have you on the program. This morning, we've got news that we've been discussing all morning about this 10% tariff to be hiked up to 25% by June. Do you think it will make a difference in this escalation?
Oh, it's a really good question. I mean, I think that what President Trump is doing here is completely undermining any of his other actions around the world by this sort of interference in Greenland, in European affairs. And as obviously a NATO ally, it just completely undermines the United States. So it's a really interesting escalation. We sort of woke up to the news today and I thought, oh my gosh, like this is just you're just completely undermining really this 500 odd years of European sovereignty and their approach to, sovereignty post-Westphalia. So it's a really interesting development. Whether or not it is simply a threat more than anything else is yet to be seen.
It's really great to be here today to talk on another topic that's been quite interesting and often in the news of late, and that is Iran, for a very long time known as Persia, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that background. And we have a special guest with us today, Erin, as well.
Yes, thanks very much, Neil. And a little teaser there that we've got a guest with us. But it's been a really interesting week in the international politics space. Like, there is no shortage of things for us to be talking about. We've got Trump blackmailing European allies in pursuit of his Greenland agenda. You've got BRICS doing maritime exercises off the coast of South Africa. But the real story that we wanted to drill down into is what is happening in Iran. And I think that we landed on this because, many of us are a little bit confused. Obviously, there's been, the internet blackout. There's been a lack of media reporting. There's been a bunch of things happen, but I reckon some of our listeners will be interested to get a little bit more of the facts, hopefully, a little bit of the history of Iran as well, and then we can and go to our guest because, as someone who works in international politics, I think the most important thing is understanding that you don't know everything about international politics.
Absolutely.
And so, yes, so very, very exciting to have my dear friend, Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert with us today. But before we bring Kylie into the chat, Neil, let's talk about Iran. Tell us a little bit more about the details, where this country is, what size it is, and so on and so forth.
Excellent. So Iran is a very interesting country, obviously located in the Middle East. It's actually the second largest country in the Middle East. It's also the 17th largest country globally. So geographically, quite a large country, and it has had an impact on a whole heap of historical events. In another podcast, we're surely going to dive into our connection to India. And one of the most interesting things that I discovered over India is it has a very big population of Zoroastrians, which are originally from what is now modern day Iran. But I did also do some research beforehand for some curious facts and figures about Iran. And Iran, interestingly enough, once arrested 14 spy squirrels in 2007. So there were squirrels outside a nuclear enrichment facility, and the Iranian army thought that they were American spies wearing small recording devices that could be used for eavesdropping. And so Iran is one of the few countries in the world that has actually arrested squirrels for espionage. So that's my sort of introductory fact of the day as we dive into Iran. Did you know that, Erin? Were you up?
No, I had no
squirrel
idea,
arrest?
and I'm more curious to know if Kylie knew that one as well. But no, I hadn't heard that. I mean, it kind of reminds me of the monkeys in Bali. The ones that come up and sort of steal your wallet, and steal your food, and that stuff. Yeah, exactly. But look, we do have Kylie with us today. She is a research fellow in security studies at Macquarie University, and also a former prisoner in Iran. And if any of you have not had a chance to read her book, shameless plug, fantastic read, particularly on Audible, because Kylie reads it herself. And that is how I listen to it. So we have Kylie with us today. Thanks so much, Kylie, for joining us.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Please help us unpack what's going on in Iran. It's been really like my own experience of trying to understand the situation. I'm looking through social media, and I think I've said to you separately, I can't tell what's real. I can't tell what's fiction. I can't tell what's propaganda. It's really difficult. So from your perspective, someone's obviously very deep in this, what is going on? What's happening in Iran right now?
It's actually really difficult to know exactly what is happening right now because there's been an internet blackout for more than a week at this point. And what has trickled out, and, it's only a tiny fraction of probably the stories that will come out in a big deluge once it finally is restored, is really, really shocking and alarming. All indications point to a horrific massacre having occurred, I think mostly between the dates of 8th and 9th of January. But we're not, 100% sure because of that blackout. Communication lines, so, mobile phone coverage, landlines, internet access, everything was cut. And this was perpetrated under the cover of darkness, essentially. Even Starlink has been jammed by military jamming devices, reportedly as well. So it's actually really difficult to know. You're getting all kinds of figures thrown around. The latest that I've seen has been about 16,500 people killed. That was reported by, I think, CBS News out of the US. But we don't know. It could be much higher. It could be well into 20,000 people. I've also seen reports of more than 300,000 people injured, mostly through live fire, through military-grade weapons, and, live bullets being fired at peaceful, unarmed protesters in the streets, essentially. So yeah, what we've seen, the footage, the videos, the clips, the witness testimony that's come out of Iran, I mean, this tiny trickle via Starlink has been utterly shocking. This looks like one of the worst massacres that's ever occurred in the modern Middle East, comparable perhaps to the Hummer massacre in Syria of the 1980s. So yeah, it's really shocking stuff. And unfortunately, I don't think enough attention has been focused on this issue, either via the media or in international fora as well.
Yeah, whereas I think someone like me, I'm well and truly in that algorithm, right? So I'm getting it pushed through to an extent, but it's like, how do you actually verify any of this information? And then therefore, I'm really sort of hesitant to share it. Like I'll share things that, I think I shared one from Yalda Hakim the other day, and where I can sort of verify the journalist, and I know that, what they're saying is probably, not too far from the truth. But what I have also found interesting this weekend is that the Supreme Leader of Iran came out and said, yeah, like lots of people have died, thousands of people have died, and this is the US's fault. What do you sort of make of that accusation?
There's a lot of misinformation, particularly in the post-October 7 online social media space. But yes, this is the playbook of the Islamic Republic going all the way back to the 1979 revolution and onwards. It's always been a US hand or an Israeli hand or even a British hand behind the scenes, puppeteering, controlling everything. These protesters, by most accounts numbering, into the dozens, if not hundreds of thousands, are all, doing the bidding of a foreign entity, and are not taking to the streets because of some organic grassroots uprising motivated by domestic grievances, heaven forbid. So, I mean, that narrative doesn't have much credence. I think irrespective of Trump's tweets, they would have said that. That's always been the playbook. There's always a foreign hand behind the scenes. But Trump obviously poured fuel on the fire through a number of Truth Social posts and kind of interviews or sort of answering questions flung at him by journalists, some on the White House lawn on this issue, where he just kind of freelanced and, said quite a few correct things, like, yes, Ayatollah Khamenei is a very sick man, quote unquote, to say what Trump said, but also promising assistance, saying we're locked and loaded, we're ready
Help's
to
on
go.
its way. Yeah.
Help's on its way.
Yeah.
And then no help was forthcoming. I mean, he actually encouraged the protesters to take over institutions, to take to the streets, to keep fighting, giving the impression that the United States was going to intervene on their side. And they did nothing. So that's also a shocking and shameful, betrayal of those poor, unarmed, innocent people, as well as sort of makes a mockery of the US deterrence factor, and sort of brings to mind Obama's red lines over Syrian chemical weapons, for example, which turned out to be a blunder and a foreign policy disaster for him. So, I do think it's significant, but the Iranian regime was going to claim that there was an American hand behind this, no matter what Trump did or said.
And Kylie, it would be really interesting as well, just to give people a little bit of your background and story. So, you have an amazing book out over sort of some of the history of Iran, but what got you interested in Iran, and what, how did you end up imprisoned in Iran? What's a little bit about your personal connection and story?
My academic expertise is mainly the Arab states. So I wrote my PhD on the Arab Gulf states, not Iran. But obviously Iran is the northern neighbor in the Persian Gulf, and you can't write about the Gulf without touching on Iran as well. But I was invited to an academic conference in Iran in 2018 by an Iranian university, and I got my visa in advance, and everything was approved and cleared. And I went for what I thought would be 2.5 weeks, and unfortunately got detained at the airport while attempting to leave the country by the Revolutionary Guard, and was thrown in prison, given a 10-year prison sentence for espionage. And I served more than 2 years and 3 months of that sentence in 2 different Iranian prisons before being freed in a prisoner swap deal negotiated by the Australian government. So as a result, I've sort of obviously developed more of an interest in Iran following all of that. And I learned Farsi in prison, and I met many amazing Iranian people, and and got to know quite a few Revolutionary Guard as well. And I guess from that personal experience has developed an academic interest in the subject as well.
Can you, Kylie, so we sort of talk about Iran and we talk about the IRGC. Can you, for someone unfamiliar, can you sort of explain, who they are and what the dynamics are in Iran when it comes to particularly the IRGC? Because I think they're kind of like a state within a state, right?
Yeah, they are the classic state within a state. This is a classic kind of divide and conquer strategy masterminded by Ayatollah Khomeini, the precursor, the guy who did the revolution in 79, and then continued by Khamenei, the current supreme leader, whereby you have multiple competing factions that are constantly jostling with one another, and you preside over the lot from above, and play each faction off against each other to maintain power. And so this is what happened. The IRGC was set up as a rival military force to the actual Iranian army, which had to go through an ideological restructuring following the revolution anyway, and purges of generals that were loyal to the Shah and, etc. So they set up this parallel structure, which was tasked with ensuring the aims and the goals of the Islamic Revolution, specifically the Islamic Revolution, would be maintained. And they are loyal only to the supreme leader. They answer directly to him. They don't answer to the civilian government or the Majlis, the parliament of Iran. And, they're brutal. They are ideologically extremely hardline Shia Islamist in worldview, virulently anti-Semitic, but also, anti-Sunni, I would say as well, based on a lot of my conversations with them. They are responsible for most of the terror financing that's been happening for couple of decades or more now, again, spearheaded by Iran in other parts of the Middle East. So all of those terror proxies, the so-called axis of resistance that Iran had built up prior to October 7 and still maintains, but in a much more weaker state today, that's all been the IRGC's doing. They also have a rival intelligence organization to the actual Ministry of Intelligence in Iran. And so I was arrested by IRGC intelligence, not by the Iranian government intelligence organization. So it's like having 2 CIAs and 2 national militaries, and 2 of, they have extensive economic interests too. They function like a mafia gang in many ways as well. And so they have rival economic and business interests to a lot of Iranian companies and state-owned enterprises, including in the oil sector as well. So they've got their tentacles in every aspect of the Iranian society, politics, economy.
So when we talk about bringing down the government in Iran now, all these protesters, like, what is the end game? Is it the IRGC, or is it the government of the day? Who is their primary target, if not both? What is that dynamic?
It's everyone and everything associated with this regime. Yeah. It's got to that point, right? We saw the first mass protest movement in Iran in 2009, the so-called Green Movement, which was triggered by a stolen election. And this is an authoritarian election. So a stolen authoritarian election with, where only two closely vetted and loyal to the regime candidates were allowed to run at all, were allowed to stand in that final presidential election. And still the system was rigged in favour of one of them, the more hardline one, Ahmadinejad. And that was, in a way, the last attempt to reform the regime from within, where people took to the streets, not because they wanted to overthrow the whole structure itself, although I'm sure some of them did, but others were just angry that their vote was stolen, their vote within the confines of that regime and the way that it operated. Since that movement, every subsequent uprising has been about removing this regime altogether, not about reforming it from within. It's beyond reform. I think it's largely accepted inside and outside the country that these guys are unreformable, and you need to have wholesale renewal and reconstruction. So IRGC is much loathed and hated. So is the Besiege, which is the popular mobilization militia force that's affiliated with the IRGC, but made up of civilian volunteers who are very ideological, very committed, brainwashed people who have also been in the streets shooting protesters recently. They want to remove all of it. And the guy at the top, the supreme leader, who's, again, presiding over all of this and is responsible for these atrocities ultimately.
And so what is it going to take to bring them down? That's a really big question to be asked.
I know. Look, this is, prior to this massacre, this bloodbath, because there's no other word for it, many people, including myself, would have said sustained popular mobilization against the regime could have brought them down. Nobody anticipated that they would be this bloodthirsty, that this is, Bashar al-Assad in 2011 level. I'm going to kill my way out of these protests, and I'm going to force my re-control of this, no matter how many hundreds of thousands I kill. I mean, that was the attitude of Assad. And many pointed out that the IRGC was very active on the ground supporting Assad at that time and probably helped him write the playbook. So now they're implementing it at home. And I think most people just didn't expect that they would be as violent as they have been. In subsequent protests, they used tear gas, rubber bullets, shotgun pellets, and they killed a lot of people, arrested, executed protesters, but not at the scale that we have seen. 500 people were killed odd in the months-long protests of 2022, the Woman Life Freedom Uprising.
Yeah.
They've potentially killed, 20,000 people in just a few short days.
For those who might be listening and aren't as familiar with sort of some of the history of Iran, and it's a very complex kind of history that goes back to sort of pre the Common Era, what's your sort of reflections in sort of a potted history of a couple of minutes as to sort of how Iran got here today? So obviously there was the Arab conquest of Iran sort of around the 7th century, if I remember correctly. And then sort of we've had a Shah that you've referred to a little bit, and then the revolution in 79. Sort of in a couple of minutes, how would you sort of paint the history of Iran historically and how they got to today?
In a couple of minutes, huh? That's a tough one. I mean, we're talking about thousands of years.
This is your 30-second thesis of Iran's history.
Oh my God. Well, I mean, obviously there's the ancient Persian Empire, and most Iranians today, particularly Persian Iranians, trace their lineage back to, Cyrus the Great, Darius the Great, the incredible achievements of that empire and the civilization that it built and developed, and they're very proud of that. And, they would say that Iran is that old. Iran is thousands of years old as a political entity.
What percentage of the population would refer to themselves as sort of originally Persian? Like, is it the majority or the minority, or how does that sort of work on the ground?
It's actually slightly less than 50% are ethnically Persian. I think it's 48, 49, depending on the parameters. Now, that's really interesting because it's been dominated by that Persian political elite since medieval times onwards, really. Although, the Safavids who re-established Iran and actually made it a Shia country rather than a Sunni country, and that's the medieval dynasty that ruled Iran until the 1700s. they, were, some of them were originally Turkic in origin, not Persian. But there's a lot of mixing, certainly. I mean, these lines are not clear cut. For example, the Kurds, there are Sunni and Shia Kurds. The grandfather of the current Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi, who's been agitating of late, Reza Shah, he forcibly moved a whole lot of Kurds from the Sunni periphery into, the eastern part of the country, and many of them became Shia and not Sunni. And so there's been efforts to sort of not ethnically cleanse, but ethnically mix by force, I guess, parts of the country. So it's not a clear-cut picture, but there are huge ethnic and religious minority groups in Iran, and many of them have not been on board with a centralized state, which has been, a source of conflict throughout history too.
And another dynamic to quiz you on, Kylie, the reason we met was through someone I went to school with, actually, after you came back from Iran. Our dear friend Ian gets a shout out. But we went to school with someone who was Iranian Baha'i refugee, and a friend of mine wrote a PhD, a really interesting PhD, on the experience of the Baha'i Iranian refugees in Australia. So what's also that kind of element to the ethnic and religious history of Iran?
Yeah, well, the Baha'i religion is a relatively new religion, and it emerged out of sort of an esoteric form of Shia Islam, I believe, but it is not at all a Muslim sect. It's sort of post-Islamic in many ways. And for that reason, they have been persecuted throughout their history by, Iranian clerics. And then after the revolution, the regime and the government itself basically outlawed the Baha'i religion and cracked down in a very vicious way on them and their religious practice, in part because apostasy is banned in Islam. So Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. There are no prophets after him. And, the Baha'i believe they have, I think his name is Baha'u'llah, although I might be getting that wrong. So sincere apologies if I'm getting that wrong, dear Baha'i listeners. But, they have broken away from that and added to it, which is apostasy, according to traditional Muslims, and therefore punishable by death in Sharia law. So this is, and we've seen this with other sects in the Middle East, like, the Yazidis, what happened to them in Iraq. I mean, ISIS justified that genocide of Yazidis under the exact same terms as the persecution of the Baha'i in Iran.
And the Baha'i religion, their headquarters is in Haifa in Israel. Kylie, what's your sort of thoughts and reflections as to sort of why it's there and the basis of the religion in another conflict zone in the Middle East?
So I'm not an expert in Baha'i, but from what I understand, Baha'u'llah, one of the founders of the Baha'i faith, due to the persecution he suffered prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, I think in the 19th century it must have been, his burial site's actually in Akko in Israel, which is very close to Haifa, just on the other side of the Bay of Haifa there. And so they've established their world headquarters, probably due to the persecution they suffered in Iran, in what would have been Ottoman-controlled Palestine at the time. And by coincidence, then that area came under the control of Israel in 1948 after Israel was established. And then from 1979 onwards, you've got this sort of virulently anti-Israel regime cropping up in Iran, and by happenstance, the headquarters of the Baha'i faith is in Israel today, which does not lend much assistance to their claims that, they are an organic religious movement, not puppeteered by foreign powers like Israel. So I think it makes it harder for them. But I just want to stress I'm not an expert in the Baha'i faith at all. My knowledge of them is quite rudimentary. There are a number of wonderful Baha'i citizens here in Australia that I've met and talked with and spoken about Iran with, but I cannot at all claim to speak for them or their beliefs.
Well, let me jump to another sort of question here, because I think that, for a lot of people, they're going, well, what does this mean for Australia, for example? And I think the way the politics of this plays out in Australia is quite interesting. And I quote from an AFR article last week that the progressive left must stop making excuses for Iran's tyrants. So what are your observations about how, the awareness or the protest to this horrible conflict at the moment in Iran, or these protests in Iran, how is that all playing out politically in Australia?
It really upsets me to think that, there has been some distinction drawn here, because viewing the little that we have seen of this massacre, it really truly is horrific. And the kinds of people who've been killed, many of them have been under 18 or aged in their 20s. These are young people being butchered in the streets for protesting for their right. These are ordinary people. They are not Mossad agents. They are not controlled by foreign regimes. These are just people who want what we have here, which is human rights and democracy and freedom of speech and the ability to live a good life. And there are some elements on the extreme far left that I've seen online in particular, who they don't have any sympathy for that, because my enemy's enemy is my friend, and they have cleaved so tightly to the Palestinian cause. They see the Islamic Republic in Iran as a supporter of Hamas and of those extreme elements within Palestine, within Gaza. And therefore, those protesters on the street seeking the overthrow of that great patron of Hamas must be the enemy as well. And they buy into the propaganda of the regime, saying Israel is supporting these protesters, and these guys on the far left don't like Israel, therefore they don't like the protesters, and they don't have sympathy for those children and young people who've been brutally massacred for no reason whatsoever other than wanting freedom and democracy. So that's obviously in stark opposition to what people on the left ostensibly believe, which is in freedom and democracy. It's in supporting oppressed peoples to overthrow their oppressors. Why does this paradigm suddenly become problematic in the case of Iran? It shouldn't. And I think it's fueled by misinformation online in particular. I think there's a concerted influence campaign happening on social media to try and push the Iranian narrative here, actually. But it's a real shame. And I would like to see the same level of support given to Iran that was given to the Gazan civilian population suffering under bombardment.
So, Neil, you're a Labor man, and we've seen the Prime Minister and, say, Premier Chris Minns come out and make some pretty strong statements on Iran. What do you have any observations about the left's response to Iran beyond the political class and the political elites in Australia?
So I think what we're just seeing in Australia is actually a bit of a schism, and some of the recent polling that we've seen, either the News poll or the Resolve poll that have come out today, that shows there's a left in Australia, or a centre left, of which I'd like to be part of. And then we're actually seeing a more extreme left being developed in that space as well. So if you have a look at some of the responses and feedback, particularly in relation to things like the Bondi massacre in Australia, in the Resolve and the News polling that's come out, the vast majority of Australians seem to be saying, hey, more needed to be done. The vast majority of Australians, and we're talking a 2-to-1 ratio across a lot of those pollings. So I think what's happening is we're seeing a very vocal minority in the far left in these sorts of instances, and perhaps the centre is still holding. And our aspirations and one of the reasons why we kicked off this podcast obviously together is to show that there can be a difference between the centre left and the centre right, but that there's broader extremes that we also need to be aware of. And I think it's really worrying. If you look at the numbers Kylie's spoken about today, whether it's 12,000, 16,000, 20,000 dead in a couple of days and up to 300,000 injured, that's multiples of some of the numbers that we've seen in other global conflicts in a very concentrated period of time. And I think we do need to get better at articulating that any conflict, any massacre, any genocide should be treated with the equal standard. And I think some of the double standards coming through are causing more schisms in Australia. But I do see the hope that, the polling that has come out is showing that the vast majority of Australians are sticking to the centre. But I share Kylie's view that it's really disappointing that we're not seeing more profile and discussion over what's happening in Iran and some of the history that's really rich and that has made contributions to Australia not being reflected in social media, our news and our political discourse as well.
Yeah, and I remember, Kylie, it would have been just before you went to Iran. In fact, you went in, I think, 2018, is that right? Only a couple of years before that, when I was running some programs for students in India. And I remember sending out a newsletter. Well, like, Iran is one of the new destinations for people to be going to. It felt like there was sort of this era, like if I had had the same invitation that you had, I probably would have gone to. Whereas now at the moment, we're sort of in this period where Iran is sort of, it's closing off again, and I think we all need to be really worried about that. some of the feedback we're given on this podcast is that we need to be less agreeable and we need to fight more. But I think that this is the kind of nuance that we're really sort of looking for, Neil, which is really great. So, Kylie, thank you so much for coming and chatting to us. I know I'm going to be going away and thinking about this a lot more, but also really closely watching what lies ahead in the next few days and months in particular for Iran. But given this podcast is about the pub test, which just seems like oddly too much humour for the current crisis in Iran. What do you think, Neil? Does the pub test pass the pub test when we're talking about something so serious?
I know it's a really hard one given the sort of the seriousness of the topic here, but I think, on all measures, whether you reflect on Kylie's discussion over Trump and sort of his response or lack thereof, that definitely doesn't pass the pub test. I think, the fact that we've seen largely in Australia a huge amount of silence towards what's happening in Iran, does that pass the pub test? Through to sort of
No.
Elon Musk, not even, and what we do with Starlink and other bits and pieces in those countries. I think sort of across the board, there's a general disappointment that this probably hasn't passed the pub test by any major standard, whether internationally, domestically, or even across sort of the social media, left or right, in the Australian landscape.
Yeah. And you can sort of go one step further when you think about, the current situation with President Trump and Greenland. It's like, how can you have any legitimacy in this crisis when you are, slapping 10, 25% tariffs on your European allies until they sell you Greenland? Like the whole geopolitical, the whole entire geopolitical economic environment does not pass the pub test at the moment. Kylie, are we allowed to ask you?
Oh, I mean, it's funny that this is the test when pubs are actually illegal in Iran and drinking's banned in Iran. Although I'd say that there's a huge amount of alcohol consumed, on a daily basis in that country, despite that prohibition. I would add the United Nations to this too, like where is the UN Secretary General? Why has there been no emergency session? Where's the UN Human Rights Council? They have not held a session on Iran. Notoriously they're populated with all kinds of nasty regimes full of, their own human rights abusing situations as well. So how many emergency sessions and how many General Assembly resolutions and debates and things have we seen on Gaza? Why are there crickets when it comes to Iran? I think there's a real double standard there. There's a lack of interest if it's not a Western country oppressing somebody, if it's the Muslims oppressing other Muslims, as we've seen with Sudan as well. Then somehow that's expected, the tyranny of low expectations or whatever, and we're just going to carry on as per usual. For me, that doesn't pass the pub test, and the Iranian people deserve better.
All round on this topic, no one passes the pub test, and a very big thank you, Kylie, for joining us. To finish internationally with a slightly lighter subject, there was one thing in the past week, though, that both Erin and I shared that did pass the pub test from an international diplomacy perspective. In fact, it passed the K-pop pub test. Erin, what happened with Japan and Korea in the last week?
Yes, so a week feels like a very long time in geopolitics, but yes, last week we had the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of South Korea, who are apparently, I didn't know, both amateur drummers, and they did a drumming duet to one of those K-pop Demon Hunter songs, which my kid loves. That's the only reason I know about it. But if you want to talk about soft diplomacy, I mean, this is the stuff, right? Given their really complex histories together, to see both of them do this pop up on my Instagram, I know I was sharing it immediately saying, yep, straight from the soft diplomacy toolkit. Really fantastic to see and a lot of fun.
So we've got the first female Prime Minister of Japan, a country that's very close to my heart and which I've spent a lot of time working and living, and obviously the President of South Korea drumming to K-pop Demon Hunters. So as we round out this week's podcast, we will leave you the little rift of the two of them playing their drums.
Cheers to that.
This podcast is brought to you by Baker York. We're an international public policy consulting firm that helps you navigate the Asia-Pacific region.